important there is kind of like a new politics of disability. NGOs not just coming forward saying, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong, change it. Because by and large, governments know what's wrong. Now we need a new politics of disability to enter into constructive relationship with government to move things forward. And I think that's CATA's role par excellence, to be engaging with governments out of the confines of the treaty to ask them, what are the blockages, how can we help, and here are some examples of what's happening elsewhere. That's work that CATA has been doing to an amazing degree right around the world, and not just in countries that have what we would call responsive democratic systems, but also in other countries where maybe the vitality of democracy is not so healthy. For example, she's just back from North Korea. And it kind of doesn't matter what your political system is. People are people everywhere, which is why it's so amazing to see how you can cross boundaries and actually get things going. Now, and as you will see, CATA has the talents, the skills, and I would say also the personality to make that really happen and to get electricity going where it matters most. Having said all that, let me hand you over without further delay to CATA directly.
Thank you very much, Gerard, for that nice introduction, and good morning, everyone. For me, it's a great honor to be here with you today. I couldn't join you this week earlier because I was just returning from the Conference of State Parties, but I'm glad that I was given the opportunity to still come on a Friday to participate in this summer school that is central to the development of all disability discussions around the world. And so we should be proud of being here and having this opportunity to have this summer school every year. So I thank you, Gerard, also for leading this and for allowing us to have this important space for interaction and for discussion. I would like to start by, I think, as a way of introduction by expanding a little bit on what Gerard was explaining about how special procedures work or what are special rapporteurs, because I always laugh about it and I say we talk a lot about special procedures, we talk a lot about, or I hope we talk a lot about special rapporteurs, but it's very little understanding about what these independent human rights experts actually do, what is our role in the system, etc. So first of all, this is important for development. It was based on a development discourse and not on a human rights discourse. I think I don't like to do that kind of distinction, I'm sorry, about development and human rights, but the UN does. And so they started the discussions under the development umbrella. And Ben Lindquist, as was said, also Sheikha and then Schweib, were the rapporteurs of the standard rules that were developed under that commission and under the General Assembly. After, with the adoption of the convention and the creation of the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the discussion was, good morning, Rosemary. The discussion was how we have all these human rights. We were transitioning from the Commission for Social Development to the human rights pillar of the UN, with the committee, with the convention, etc. So how do we create that transition also with what is called the special procedures? The special procedures are independent experts that are normally called special rapporteurs or independent experts, some of them, that are mandated with monitoring the situation of human rights in a given country or in a thematic issue. So you have two sorts of rapporteurs. Rapporteurs that look only, for instance, of the human rights situations in Eritrea, or you have special rapporteurs that look at thematic issues, such as the special rapporteur that you had early this week here, Mr. Denius, and like myself. So health and persons with disabilities. So basically, the human rights system creates these mandates, these special procedures, to help them understanding what are the challenges and the situations on the enjoyment of human rights of any given group or any given thematic issue in the countries. And although most states will say that these mechanisms were created with the aim of naming and shaming or just monitoring how states are doing, in reality, the special procedures, and if you go through the resolutions, are also mandated to support advancement in the implementation and the realization of rights. And in the case of the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, it also came with a strong notion of social development, because when it was transitioned from the Commission of Social Development to the Human Rights Council, states remain very aware of the need to take care of the, let's say, social aspects of, social development aspects of the role of the Special Rapporteur. So with that in mind, the resolution was created as what I call a dual mandate, a mandate that is very strong in human rights, very strong in social development, and a mandate that has a strong mandate, again, to provide technical assistance to states. And this is also because when it was created, when the resolution was drafted, the main concern of states was, okay, we have a convention, and this convention is indeed challenging a lot of the ways in which we're doing things. States have, and I won't give them the benefit of the doubt, I think that there is a genuine intention to change things, but there is still a lot of lack of knowledge and understanding of what does this mean? How do we need to do it? And so they said, well, we need to have more information, more exchange, and more support from independent experts. And so the mandate has also a very strong section on this special rapporteur should provide support to states. In that framework, I decided, and as I've been the first special rapporteur of the Human Rights Council, it was very difficult to start because, okay, where to start? As you know, special rapporteurs are mandated to create or to produce thematic reports. So we have to present 2 thematic reports a year, one to the Human Rights Council, one to the General Assembly. We are also mandated to do 2 country visits a year, and there is when we go, we visit, we sit with the government authorities, we discuss challenges, and we make recommendations on how to advance. And after the country visit, we produce also a report that is presented to a Human Rights Council. And for instance, as Gerard mentioned, in the case of the DPRK of North Korea, I visited the country, I sat with the authorities, and then afterwards I'm going to produce my recommendations in a report that is going to be publicly available and presented to a Human Rights Council. And also, we are mandated to do something that is called the communications. The communications is when I received information about human rights violations, in the case of persons with disabilities, I might receive information from civil society, from academia, from families, from persons with disabilities themselves, and say, look, in X country, we're facing this situation with regards to persons with disabilities and inclusive education and psychiatric hospitals, you name it. And then I can engage in a direct bilateral dialogue with the state engaged and say, well, you know, I've received information about this situation. why is this happening? Could you please clarify and also make recommendations? This is not, of course, a binding mechanism. This doesn't mean that the state will listen to my recommendations, but at least it puts some international pressure, because then after a period of time, these communications also become public documents, and people can know that the Special Rapporteur was concerned about the situation on children with autism in a given country, for instance. Okay, but then when I started, the big question is, okay, how to prioritize? Because we are starting, basically, we have the whole universe of issues in front of us, and how to prioritize. It was very hard to start that process. And so I started to put 3 thematic clusters. Alberto, it's a problem? No? Okay. My decision was to start with 3 thematic clusters to focus on one big component on citizenship and how to advance in the recognition of full citizenship of persons with disabilities. And this relates a lot to the discussions we're going to have today. The second cluster was poverty, also because of this dual mandate of looking at all the development aspects, but mostly because the link between poverty and disability is overwhelming, as you know. And then a third cluster that for me, I think it's central, and of course, these clusters are not silos that are separated, they're all interrelated. But for me also, one very important issue was the notion of embracing diversity, that it's at the core of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and as the understanding that persons with disabilities are just a normal part of human diversity, and that diversity should be embraced and accommodated in any given society. And how to transform that will influence the rest of all of work. Once we understand that having a disability or having an impairment, it's just a regular part of life and it's normal, then everything will come and follow the change that we need. So I also try to, in my work, and this is important, to respect, of course, the principles of the Convention and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities as the guiding tool that I have to use. Although, and this is important to say, as a special rapporteur, I can work even with countries that have not ratified the convention, because my mandate is universal, so I can work with the US, for instance, or with Ireland, so to say. But it's important because, of course, the highest standard in the recognition of human rights for persons with disabilities is the convention, and I use the CRPD principles and the convention as the guiding tool. But I also look to various principles such as participation, gender equality approach, inclusiveness, so that whatever I do is not only aiming at certain groups of persons with disabilities, but to the whole diversity of persons with disabilities. And that includes, and that it's taking me to these discussions today, that includes, of course, the situation of persons with psychosocial disabilities, right? So in all my work, I always try to bear in mind that the responses should work for a big variety of groups. And of course, because of my position, because of my interaction with states, my interaction with civil society, my interaction with other stakeholders such as service providers, universities, etc., the UN system as a whole, I have been receiving over the last 2 years and a half, almost 3 years, a lot of information, overwhelming amounts of information about what is going on in the world with regards to the situation of persons with disabilities. And that is good, because that, of course, provides me with a very important input to work and to provide recommendations, but it also allows me to reflect on what are the main challenges that we are facing, and I'm going to propose some of them to you. This perhaps is not going to be very new to you today, but it's just a synthesis of what I am seeing are one of the main challenges that persons with psychosocial disabilities might be facing, to then also reflect on some recommendations and opportunities that we have as a system to advance and to change this situation, to transform this situation. So I would like to share with you some of this, and I understand that Maria now is helping me because I forget always. I don't like PowerPoint presentations, so It's there somewhere. There's going to be something, and I'm not going to be looking at it, but Maria's probably going to help me. And it's only 2, so it's not very difficult in any way. So I wanted to talk about the main challenges, right? The main challenges that I have identified in relation with persons with disabilities. I also might need help with reminding me of time, right? And I want to discuss with you a few main issues. The first one is the medical model. The second one is the denial of personhood or the denial of legal capacity. A third one, and there's of course no order of priority whatsoever, is the lack of support services, and support as a whole. Another issue is poverty and intersectional discrimination. And then a last issue, or perhaps a closing issue, is the issue of coercion. And I'm pretty sure that you have been discussing those during this week discussions. So, but to start, and I think I last year when I was here also, I discussed that with the participants of the summer school at that time. I think that we still have a huge challenge in general to overcome the medical model. It seems that with the convention and then the human rights discourse, we have done it, right? I think that in public, no one will ever say again, it's like, yeah, we support the medical model. No, every single speech that you hear in the UN or by states that are a little bit familiar with the discussions of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities will say, we are contesting the medical model. This is no longer about persons with disabilities being sick, or it's really challenging and confronting that model. But in practice, as we all know, that is not the case, right? And this is for everybody, but I will say that for persons with psychosocial disabilities is where you will have the case study. If you as academics, if you as advocates want to take a look at how does the medical model works in practice and to see the medical model at its purest forms, please go and just engage in a discussion on mental health. You will have it all. Everything is there packed very nicely. This biomedical model, as Denius Puras also call it, it's still putting persons with disabilities and specifically persons with psychosocial disabilities as persons that need to be cured, that need to be treated, persons that need to be protected, even protected from themselves, and there's no way to challenge this in reality. I want to say that whenever you start a conversation on the human rights of persons with psychosocial disabilities, it doesn't matter if you're talking to policymakers, if you're talking to not to disability advocates, if you're talking to general advocates, if you're talking to diplomats, if you're talking to, in some cases, lawyers, academics, when you start discussions on human rights of persons with disabilities, in less than 5 seconds, you will have discussions on mental health. This always is the case. We cannot avoid going back to that discussion because we are, and I think this is a trap that we are facing. It seems that everything is framed around the medical responses and around the medical health responses in particular. And it seems then that the only way to understand the rights of persons with disability, of psychosocial disabilities, is through these mental health responses. So we are trapped. We're trapped in this narrow notion of impairment, narrow notion of mental health conditions. And what is happening is that the main priority or the main response seems to be, how do we make sure that we provide access to mental health services of quality to persons with psychosocial disabilities? And this is the main concern of policymakers, of service providers, of professionals, even for some outside advocates. And I have to say that I am concerned that some of the mainstream disability movement may also be thinking about this. And this is a challenge that we need to address urgently. So, but by doing that, by channeling this, the responses on the recognition of rights of persons with disabilities through mental health responses, the system, it's ignoring that persons with psychosocial disabilities, just as anyone else, has, other needs, social needs. We need to have, they need to have education, housing, employment, social protection, civil and political rights. So the discussion should not be framed, of course, in only in a mental health responses. Of course, that doesn't respond either to inclusion, participation, that doesn't respond to support needs of persons with disabilities. And on the contrary, and this is what you all know and what we will discuss and what you have been discussing, these mental health responses, instead of providing support, participation, and inclusion, are exposing persons with psychosocial disabilities to disproportionate human rights violations. So we see, and we all know, forced hospitalization, forced treatment, institutionalization, that are fully recognized as practices around the world, legal practices around the world, and that should, of course, be abolished, and that somehow are forcing us to keep discussing about these mental health responses, because, yeah, indeed, they are a big problem that we need to transform. And hand in hand with this notion of, or these mental health services and how these mental health services are designed, comes a lot of the stigma attached to persons with psychosocial disabilities. And that is another big problem. Of course, if you have a group of people that it's only seen through these awful practices and institutionalization for treatment, there's a lot of stigma attached to persons with disabilities that, at the end, of course, only increases their chances of being discriminated in all other aspects of their life, because they're always going to be labeled as having a mental health condition. And this is, of course, perceived as something very negative. Again, we still need to challenge these negative perceptions by using this notion of embracing diversity and understanding that diversity is just part of human life, and that this is fine. There's nothing wrong with persons with psychosocial disabilities, because this, at the end, when the strict stigma and discrimination would lead us, of course, to the denial of dignity and the right, even the right to existence of persons with disabilities. And I think that we have good practices and good examples, for instance, with the Hearing Voices movement, of how we can change that perception and how indeed it can be seen in a very positive and more, in a very positive way. But then this stigma, this discrimination, these narrow mental health responses, they're also taking us to this denial of the existence of the moral agency, as Gerard always reminds us, of persons with disabilities, and in this case of persons with psychosocial disabilities. So linked to that, what we have is legislation that is grounded in this discriminatory and paternalistic views of persons with psychosocial disabilities. So as you know, the civil codes, the mental health capacity laws, of course, any mental health law, have been created under the basis of this prejudice against persons with disabilities, and are created to actually allow for the exceptions for the exercise of legal capacity of persons with psychosocial disabilities. This is always based on the presumption of the existence of a mental health condition or the lack of mental capacity. So we say, well, this kind of people is presumed to be unable to make any kind of decision. Also, persons with disabilities are always deprived of their legal capacity, or very often deprived of their legal capacity. They have no freedom to make their decisions, even their decisions, as you know, to give free and informed consent, and then they're confined against their will in institutions. Of course, these restrictions on legal capacity that are allowed by most of the legislations and I will say most of the countries, the big majority of the countries with, I will say, one or two exceptions. And even if this is transforming, and I will get back to that at the end, this restriction is limiting the potential of persons with disabilities with psychosocial disabilities to exercise any of their rights in all areas of rights, not only in the area of, let's say, informed consent, but the right to have a family, the right to vote. Everything is limited by these restrictions on their exercise of legal capacity. And of course, this is not only about exercising rights, but it is also about just simply human development, and where persons with psychosocial disabilities are denied of their freedom to decide what they want to be, what they want to do, and how they want to live. And of course, all these pieces of legislation must be abolished, and we have a big challenge in transforming that kind of legislation around the world, and to change that. It's somehow we're contesting the status quo, and that is going to be a very important change. So when we are designing legislation, and when we're thinking about legislation and how to approach legislation in this area, the question shouldn't be the question that the society should be doing is not when and how a person with a psychosocial disabilities can be deprived of their rights, but instead we need to change this question, and we need to say, okay, how can we ensure that a person can fully exercise all their rights? So how do we make that? And that is an important thing. And so in this question of how can we make sure that persons with psychosocial disabilities can fully exercise their right, this question brings me to the next issue, which is the issue of support. So how are we providing the support that is needed to persons with psychosocial disabilities so that they can exercise their rights on an equal basis with others? But again, this is a challenge, because what we're seeing is that there is lack of support. Support is not existent in the big majority of our societies, our countries. And this was highlighted in my last report, the report on support for persons with disabilities, because this is an obligation, and it's a human rights obligation that it's still unfulfilled. We have been discussing a lot about accessibility, about reasonable accommodation, about discrimination, etc. But the requirement of the Convention of providing support to persons with disabilities is still far away from being a mainstream discussion, and a discussion that is advancing to transform into implementation tool and responses. So, and we have to think about that because I think it's crucial. In general, support is deeply embedded in all cultures and communities. All societies are designed on the basis of support. We support each other. Everything, every single community is designed to support the members of its community. Because, as we all know, everyone needs support at some point of their life for some concrete activities, but our systems are designed to support the participation of their members. However, the specific support that persons with disabilities need was never taken into consideration in the design of the mainstream support services and systems that we have in our communities. It was just invisible. That need of support and that different support mechanisms were just not taken into account. And so now it seems that this is an additional thing that we need to add, while it should be something that from the beginning should have been incorporated. And this is something that we need to change, and we need to have more discussions about this. We have, and this is the case, I think, for the big majority of persons with disabilities as the result of this lack of awareness on the support needs of persons with disabilities. What we're seeing is that we have very limited access to support services, where, I mean, you might think about support for inclusion, psychosocial support or support, for instance, to exercise the legal capacity, supported decision making, to make, to be able to make decisions, to express will and preference. And in many cases, when there is anything that is called support, it's actually care. And it will take us back to, we have support, we have care, we have mental health responses for you. So this is how the discussion goes. Instead of having a line of support that will actually allow persons with disabilities to exercise the right and not a response that is justifying why and how to limit the rights of persons with disabilities. And then persons with disabilities and persons with psychosocial disabilities are facing two sides of the coin, right? Whether you are totally neglected, you have no access to services, no access to support, or you are deprived of your liberty, you are forced treated, you are institutionalized, right? That is the kind of support care response that we're getting, or we're totally abandoned and neglected. And that links to the next topic, that is poverty. Poverty and intersectional discrimination. Because of course, lack of personhood, lack of support will almost inevitably took us to a discussion on poverty. Yeah? Yeah. Sorry. Should I use this one?
No, you're fine.
Yeah? It seems that I have a very little head, or no ears, or, it's like, it's weird also to have this here. Yeah? Okay, you let me know if it works better. So, okay, what I was saying, if we are neglected, if we have no support, if we have no personhood and no way to defend ourselves, then it's very likely that we're also going to be discussing about poverty. And this is not a new discussion. Of course, we know that persons with disabilities, and I mentioned that before when I decided on my thematic clusters, we know that persons with disabilities are overrepresented among the poorest in the world. And in the case of persons with psychosocial disabilities, for instance, we all know that persons with disabilities with psychosocial disabilities are overrepresented among those that are homeless. And this is mainly because of the lack of support for living in the community. So whether you're homeless or whether you're an institution, these are your alternatives, and a hospital or in the streets. And also, this is the lack of support and the lack of adequate social protection systems, because persons with psychosocial disabilities, they have no access, for instance, to benefits or to income support or to disability-related extra costs. And this is also something that I discussed in a specific report on social protection. So without support, without social protection, then the trap continues to grow. We need to think about this carefully, and we need to give more attention to discussions on support and social protection, because in these discussions, we need to start taking these discussions under a human rights-based approach, because that is the other challenge we have. Most of the social protection discussions are not being framed under a human rights-based approach, and then they might reproduce the same kind of responses. They might say, as a social protection, as a benefit, you will have access to psychiatric treatment, you will have access to institutionalization and hospitalization, right? So yes, we need to have social protection, but that social protection needs to be framed under a human rights-based approach and needs to be respectful of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And that discussion needs to happen. It's a fundamental discussion to tackle the situation of poverty and lack of support of persons with psychosocial disabilities. And I think it constitutes parts of the responses that we need to create to avoid the last issue, that is the issue of coercion. Because at the end, all of these elements are leading us to justify and to let states justify coercion. Because what is the option? You're in the street, you have no way to make decisions, you have not been built to have decisions, you have no support, there's nothing for you, so as a matter of last resource, and I put this under quotes, they say, this is what we have to do, right? We need to think about coercion because this is the only way we have to deal and I underquote again, to deal with the situation of persons with disabilities. So coercion is the permanent threat for persons with psychosocial disabilities, right? Everywhere in the world. It doesn't matter if it's nicer coercion or worse coercion, it's always coercion. It is always the threat for persons with psychosocial disabilities. As I mentioned, forced treatment, and forced treatment, forced hospitalization, institutionalization, segregation at home, restraint, sterilization, all of these issues come prevalent to persons with psychosocial disabilities. And it's important to say that although a lot of these coercive practices happen in the psychiatric institutions and the psychiatric settings, it is not exclusive to the psychiatric facilities, right? So that we also have to be aware that this is not an issue against psychiatry or the psychiatric practices only, but also we have to be aware of how some of these practice could happen at home, could happen at the community, could happen at social care centers. And this is something that I have witnessed through my work firsthand. And perhaps many of you that are practitioners and are working in this area know that as well. But the issue is that this coercion, because of all these reasons, is actually accepted. And with few exceptions, and probably I will say that, people here around the room will say, yeah, this is unacceptable, we cannot do that. But once we leave the room and once we leave the internal disability discussions and we go out on the surface to talk to the mainstream people, it is widely accepted that this is a practice, that it's okay, that it's fine. It's not like a question of, are we limiting human rights? Is this against human rights? That those questions are not there. And of course, in the mental health system is where these practices are more normalized. There is this asymmetry power between the doctors and persons and the patients with psychosocial disabilities. The voice of persons with disabilities doesn't exist. Once you are in a psychiatric facilities, the power dynamics just nullify the possibility of existence of persons with disabilities. Also, you have a strong legislation, like the mental health legislation, that actually legitimizes the coercion. And in practice, and as I said before, the mental health legislation has this rights rhetoric. They used to say, we have safeguards in place. We are really looking to make this more, safe for persons with disabilities, limiting the abuse, but as a matter of last resort, and for the shortest appropriate period of time, we can have coercion, right? So even if they have a human rights rhetoric under that legislation, what we have is just the legitimization or the way in which we say, yes, it is okay, because at the end, this is what we need to do. And that opens the door, of course, to these human rights violations. And I think, and this seems pretty basic, right? But we always have to insist on this. Coercion and forced treatment or care is in no way protection, right? A human rights violation is in no way protection. And we have to change that because it's sold to us, it's sold by the policymakers like if this is for your own good, this is to protect you. But in no case that argument should be accepted. That is not protecting persons with disabilities. That is not protecting persons with psychosocial disabilities. Violating their rights is not a way to protect their rights. And this should be very simple. And it should be very simple, but still, this is something that it's very hard to understand. And of course, now, the advantage is that we have the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, because the Convention is calling us clearly to abolish these laws, to abolish these practices that are limiting the rights of persons with disabilities, and is changing the paradigm to say, instead of asking yourself how to better limit the rights of persons with disabilities, ask yourself how to better support persons with disabilities to exercise their rights. So we are facing also a lot of opportunities because of the convention and because of the adoption of the convention and because Article 12, Article 14, Article 17, Article 25 of the convention, and I will say all the articles of the convention if you start linking them. But those articles, of course, are central. So the discussions around these issues have dramatically changed since the negotiations and since the adoption of the convention. And now we really have an instrument that is allowing us to be really straightforward in challenging the status quo. And I think we don't have to be afraid of doing that. We are doing that. We should move ahead with doing that. And this is the beauty, actually, of the convention. This is the transformative nature of the convention. Yes, we want to challenge everything because this is wrong. And this is wrong in this case, and particularly for persons with disabilities. So the CRPD helped us to understand that there is not question on the existence of human diversity, but actually what we are questioning is the existence of structures, practices, systems, and legislations that are contrary to the full enjoyment of rights of persons with disabilities. And this is a fantastic transformative tool. The CRPD, again, is also taking us away from the medical approach, from a paternalistic approach. The CRPD challenged coercion in any way. It prohibits deprivation of liberty on the basis of disabilities. And I think as very important, the CRPD is bringing the notion of universal human rights to another level. We are, with the CRPD, the understanding of the universality of human rights, it's really going back to the core meaning of universality. It's like understanding that indeed all human rights, all persons, all human beings should have and should exercise and should enjoy their human rights and freedoms on an equal basis with others. And I think this is also important so that we can say, it's not, and I sometimes try to say that when I confronted to say, the convention is bringing all these new standards and all these new, rights, which we might have a discussion on whether the convention brings or not the notion of new rights. But when it comes to, for instance, informed consent, I said well, that is not new, right? This has been in place for a few years now, right? So this is nothing that the convention is changing. The only thing that the convention is saying is that, yes, persons with psychosocial disabilities also have the right, as any other person, to provide free and informed consent. So this is why we are opening and broadening the notion of universality. And, of course, the CRPD has also provoked a new narrative in the United Nations system, and I think at the international system as a whole. In the discussions, academic discussions like we are having today, these discussions are not the same that the discussions that we have 11 years ago or 20 years ago when the convention was not even a dream. So, for instance, we have now the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which has been instrumental in this regard in changing this narrative, because the committee has been challenging coercion, it's been challenging the denial of legal capacity, it's advocating for support, and it's calling, of course, for the equal enjoyment of all human rights for persons with disabilities. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights is also in the same line. And for instance, they recently issued a report on mental health and human rights, and a report that reaffirms the need to end with all human rights violations against persons with disabilities in the context of mental health. As you've heard, and he was here, of course, the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health is also contributing to creating this new narrative, and he's challenging psychiatry itself, and is challenging the lack of commitment of the psychiatric community to engage in discussions on human rights. The Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, which is another special procedure of the Human Rights Council, as well as other rapporteurs, are also including in their work human rights standards that are in line with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And this, of course, it's opening new ways to protect the rights of persons with disabilities, including persons with psychosocial disabilities. And by the way, that is also part of my work, to try to mainstream these discussions in the work of other parts of the human rights system. The WHO, and I'm very happy that Michelle and Natalie are here, the WHO has also changed their position, and this is very important, also a big change in what used to be considered as the status quo, but at least we are seeing very exciting developments with the WHO Quality Rights Initiative, also with the repeal of its own resource book on mental health, human rights and legislation, because before this was the guidelines for any creation of a mental health legislation, and now this team has clearly stated that the resource book is not in line with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, so is not longer a tool that should inform the work of the states when creating this legislation. And I think, as Dennis mentioned, something like that, I don't know why we need to have mental health legislation at all. And this is also a very important discussion. It is true, however, that we still, this discussion is not closed just because the CRPD is there, and you all know that. I don't have to tell you that. Yeah, we still have differences. We still have challenges among human rights experts within the human rights community, within different, for instance, treaty bodies. Some jurisprudence of the treaty bodies is not as progressive as we want it to be. But what we cannot deny is that we are moving forward. Nothing has remained the same. Even though it's not moving at the pace that we want or to the extent that we want it, things are moving forward. And so what I see, and I think this is also to put some optimism in this discussion, is that this is unstoppable. The change is going to happen. It might take us 200 years or it might take us 10 years, right? But I think it depends on how we move with that. How good do we get in our arguments? But this is not we're gonna get there. We're gonna make this change, and this change is happening. And it's happening very fast, actually. If you see from where we started 11 years ago with the adoption of the convention till now, how discussions have moved forward, it's really impressive. And sometimes it's hard for us to see it because we are, myself, I have to say, sometimes frustrated because I want to see change yesterday and not tomorrow, but still this is happening. So what we're seeing is that more and more countries are considering and revising their legislation, so they're considering changes to their legislation. They're moving towards with those changes to recognize legal capacity of persons with disabilities, for instance. We also see more and more good practices of experiences of support, how to support persons with disabilities. And although we still need to scale those projects up, I think that we are seeing more responses coming out, and hopefully we will be able to, in a short period of time, scale them to a national policy level design, for instance. There is also growing evidence of the benefits of these responses, these support responses, in comparison with the mental health responses or with narrow responses that allow for the violation of rights of persons with disabilities. And we need to have more and more evidence in that regard to make sure that we can say, this is not only that you're limiting my rights, but actually there are ways to protect actually persons with psychosocial disabilities without limiting or violating their rights. And so I think that this also very important. And this is a narrative that I think we have to be careful of, not to keep as something that it's in the margins, but we also need, actually we need to take it as a central part of the discussion, of the debate. I myself, I'm currently working at the same time in 2 of my thematic reports. As I mentioned before, I have to do 2 thematic reports a year, and I will present them to the Human Rights Council. One, it's going to be on supported decision-making, so on all the issues of legal capacity, and the other one that will follow that will be report on the specific forms of deprivation of liberty on the basis of disability. And this is aiming to systematize and put in value some of these good practices that are around, but also it looks to provide further guidance to states in how to realize these two important rights. And I hope that will be also a strong tool for advocacy for all of you working in this area. And of course, these projects and this research and these reports are being done in broad consultation with the stakeholders. I think that we have, of course, and I'm starting to close, there is, of course, a lot to do. You know, we need more champions, we need more good practices, we need more evidence, we need more strategic litigation, we need more policy packages, and we need to prove and to offer policymakers solutions. But first, and this is very important, we need to convince ourselves that we have the capacity to work together strategically to offer a good narrative to move ahead, to offer this concrete narrative that is going to help us change in the situation. And this is where we are at. We have the capacity to do it, but we still need to fine-tune the narrative that is going to make us move towards the change that we want, the broader change that we want. So I want to close with some words of I don't know, with a reminder of the context in which we are. As you all know, the discussions of mental health around the world or internationally, they are facing a really good momentum. I mean, it seems that mental health has become a very sexy topic lately. And so across the globe, we're having all these international discussions about mental health. It's a priority on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Then we have also the Global Mental Health Action Plan. Promoting mental health and well-being is now, and many states say that is a priority for them. Many countries, and this is also something to be aware of and perhaps worried about, many countries are adopting new mental health action plans, and there are now many of them are under discussions, and they are discussing how best to include the mental health related care and the medicines under the universal health coverage. And this, although it may sound like another challenge, right? Because it seems that the overwhelming discourse on the medical model is taking momentum. I think that this is also a good opportunity for change. We can use that opportunity for transforming the situation. And I think that many of you will be engaged in a set of discussions that we will have later today about this. But this is, again, an opportunity that we cannot miss to make sure that all these discussions are done and include a human rights discussion. But of course, this opportunity or this ship, it has already sailed, right? This is happening with or without us. And so we really need to make sure that we are on board in that kind of discussion. And that we make sure that whatever we do, those discussions will be in line with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And then, and I finish with that, is, again, this idea of how do we work in this inclusion narrative? How do we reshape the state responses? And how do we address the state's concern in this? Many of us think that, this is so clear, but we really need to address the concerns of states, and we really need to, as I said, fine-tune our narrative to make sure that we are providing them with the responses they need to change. They might change. I'm pretty sure that they will change, but I'm also pretty sure that we need to strengthen our efforts to build that narrative and to strengthen that narrative. I think that we have all the elements, but we need to strengthen the narrative to be able to get them on board for the change. With that, I end. I'm pretty sure that I can count, and we can count And you can count with me for this change. And I'm looking forward to engaging with you in these discussions. I thank you, Gerard. Thank you.